welcome everyone to today's webinar, the SCERTS Model and Introduction. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are really excited about our Pathways Education series, which is continuing tonight. So we have webinars scheduled monthly over the course of the year. So tonight is March's webinar. Next month we have Managing the Chaos, Being Intentional About Your Routine. That's going to be Monday, April 8th. And then we have our second of 3 SCERTS model webinars in May. So we're going to have Dr. Laurent again, May 19th at 7 p.m. So just to get us started, I want to make sure that everyone knows we are taking questions at the end. So on your GoToWebinar panel, you should see a section that says questions. At any time throughout the webinar, please feel free to type in any questions for our speaker, and we are going to leave some time at the end for that. So a little bit about our speaker today. So Amy Laurent is a developmental psychologist and a registered pediatric occupational therapist. She's currently in private practice and specializes in the education of children with autism spectrum disorders and related developmental disabilities. The majority of Amy's work involves collaborating with and supporting early intervention teams, school teams, and families. Her consultative services focus on the creation of educational programs and environments that facilitate children's active engagement and learning at home, in schools, and throughout their communities. The SCERTS model, of which she is a co-author, along with differentiated instruction and developmental theory, guide her practice. Amy is currently an adjunct faculty member for the Department of Psychology at the University of Rhode Island. She teaches courses focused on developmental psychology. Previously, she has served as an adjunct faculty member for the Communications Disorders Department at Emerson College and at the University of Rhode Island. In these roles, she developed graduate courses focused on preparing clinicians to meet the needs of children with autism, as well as the needs of their families. So without further ado, I am going to pass the torch to our speaker, and she will get started.
Hi, everybody. It's so funny to talk to my computer and not see you, but thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk to your group. I have had the really excellent fortune of working with 2 individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, so I am feeling like it's special to be invited by you all. So can you see, Jackie, that window, is that covering my slide for you, or is that okay for you?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. I just didn't, because the go-to meeting is up in my corner. I just didn't know if it was blocking for you as well. So perfect. All right, so I am super excited to be able to have the opportunity to introduce the SCERTS model to you as a community and talk about the applicability of it to the kiddos and individuals in your life who are so important to you. And in order to talk about the SCERTS model, I want to make sure that I'm super clear that you all know that I am not just representing my work as I talk to you tonight and over the course of our time together during this webinar series. I'm actually representing the work of 4 active collaborators on the model, and I will give a really brief introduction of each of them here, just so you have a sense of what SCERTS is and how it developed, because I think the history of SCERTS is really important in understanding the comprehensive nature of it, as well as the transdisciplinary nature of it. So some of you might be familiar with Dr. Barry Tarzan. He is the first author on the model, and he's very well known, especially in early communication development for children with autism spectrum disorders. And SCERTS is grounded in his dissertation practice. So in the 1970s, echolalia was still thought to be psychotic speech when we were thinking about autism and related social communicative disabilities. And Barry was working at a summer camp at the time for individuals with a variety of intellectual disabilities and learning differences. And he was also a psycholinguistics major. And he had this really thoughtful, insightful idea that it wasn't psychotic speech, it was actually quite communicative, the way individuals used echolalia. So his doctoral dissertation became a project in being able to demonstrate the effectiveness of echolalia for pretty much every function of communication and some regulatory functions. So including when the students or the children were bored or overwhelmed in their environment. And that really forms the basis of SCERTS, this early work in the 1970s, looking at and honoring unique learning styles and using that information and working within that strength to help individuals develop. So Barry's here in Rhode Island, where I live. I live in Rhode Island, and we have the good fortune of working together on a fairly regular basis, which I'm really grateful for. He's also the author of a book that many of you may be familiar with called Uniquely Human, and it's gotten some great rave reviews around the globe since it's been published just about, I don't know, maybe 2 years now. So that's Barry. Amy Weatherby is at Florida State University. She is amazing. She is a researcher without kind of equal in my mind. She holds more grants than I can even begin to think about, but she is very much the person within the model that holds our feet to the fire in terms of evidence base. And she's also the primary efficacy researcher of the SCERTS model. So there have been 2 very large randomized control studies using SCERTS, one in an early intervention setting, birth to 3 population, and the other in a school setting looking at early childhood education. And so that was kindergarten through 2nd grade. And these studies were randomized, so students or children were either in a control situation, which was kind of a business as usual situation, or they were in the SCERTS condition. They were both crossover studies, so if they didn't get the SCERTS condition initially, they did get it later. So it was a very well thought out study. But she is really the person who has been able to demonstrate the efficacy of SCERTS both in public school systems as well as a traditional early intervention system where we know there's limited services available. So the early intervention study was actually a parent training model. So clinicians would go into the home 2 to 3 hours a week, which we often see in an early childhood model, but no more, but teaching parents how to adapt their natural routines to facilitate communication and regulation within the context of natural routines. And the outcomes of these studies were really remarkable. In fact, for the early intervention study, they saw within a 9-month period growth in every indicator that they collected, including for the children, their ADOS scores, so their diagnostic observation scale scores, within a 9-month period. So really significant progress. And then the same with the school age study. One of the things we were looking at with the school age study was whether we could bring a school system up to efficacy, whether teachers could actually learn how to implement the model and do it within a calendar school year. And we were able to demonstrate that teachers were able to not only do that, but then also affect change within their students. And this change really came around active engagement, which is what we'll be talking a bit about tonight, and communicative reciprocity and initiation, which I know you are all very interested in for the kiddos and the individuals in your life. So that's Amy. And then Emily Rubin is a speech language pathologist who is amazing. She's at Marcus Autism Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and she has the good fortune of working with Ami Klin, who is one of the leading neuropsychologists in the field of social communicative disorders. And one of the things that was really wonderful about Emily, as we were writing the model, she had access to all of this kind of cutting edge neuroscience work that was being done. And so we always talk about that gap, right? The gap that happens between research and practice, and how do you make that bridge? And Emily was in a really beautiful position to kind of feed us, as we were writing the model, all this emerging neuroscience work and understanding how learning differences impacted individuals' ability to perceive and take in and process the environment, and we were able to pull that into the model. So she's currently the educational outreach specialist for Marcus, and honestly, she's in London right now. She's all over the world all the time teaching. She's dynamic and fantastic. If you ever have the chance to hear her speak, I strongly, strongly recommend it. And then there's me, and you heard all about me, and I always feel so funny during those introductions. I always feel like somebody should say, and she likes taking long walks on the beach, and she also knits. But I do have a very transdisciplinary background in terms of being an OT, a special educator, and a developmental psychologist. So my 3 collaborators are all speech language pathologists, but also with backgrounds in psychology, and as I said, Barry with neurolinguistics and whatnot. So we have a very diverse background, and when we come together, that's really what we think is the strength of the model. We don't feel that any one discipline has all the answers in terms of educating children with complex social communication needs, and we need to make sure that we're bringing in the different perspectives, and it's those different perspectives that when knitted together really create the strength of the model. So hopefully as we talk tonight, or I talk at you and you ask me questions later, that will come through, that you'll really feel that transdisciplinary nature of the model and how each of the different perspectives are interwoven. Okay, so I know this is a great time to ask this question, and I know that Jackie's going to help me out and pop up a question for you all. I want to know how many of you are familiar with SCERTS in general?
All right, we have about 50, 60, 70% voted. Very good. All right, we'll give it a second and then close it out. Okay.
So about a quarter of you are familiar with SCERTS, and the other 75% of you are not. So this is great. So this is an opportunity for us to be able to have a great conversation and give you this introduction. Now, SCERTS is a very complex model, so you are getting the speed Cliff Notes version. The good part is we have the opportunity to extend this conversation over other webinars together. So if you leave here going, oh my gosh, she crammed a lot in a little bit of time, but I'm still not sure what she said, we've got more time together, which is great. And I also answer emails when people send me them. So let me just give you what the acronym stands for, because you can't have a model of education in special education without having an acronym. Like, it's a silly joke, but it's actually true. Like, think about every model of education you know, and they all have acronyms, and we are no exception. So SCERTS stands for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support. So those are the 3 primary domains of the model. So when we're thinking about intervention, we're thinking about educating children on the autism spectrum or who have related social communicative difficulties, these are kind of what we hold up as our pillars and our top priorities in educating children, because this is typically what qualifies them for special education in the first place. So this is the foundation that we feel that is really necessary. So obviously social communication makes a lot of sense if we're talking about autism and related disabilities. We know it's a qualifying component in terms of diagnostic qualification, right? Then there's the emotional regulation side, which is actually the part that I was brought into the model to flesh out initially when we were writing the model, which is really kind of how available for learning is it somebody? How regulated are they? How able are they to attend? Where's their arousal level? Like, is it a good match for the social and physical environment? And then those 2 areas, the social communication and emotional regulation, are the areas that we seek to facilitate development within the children, within the students, within the individuals in our lives who have these learning challenges. Okay, so that's where we scaffold development within the individual. The transactional support side of the model, which we know sounds a little bit jargony, and it's from the developmental literature, is the part of the model which really fully embraces that learning is a 2-way street. So this is a partnership, and transactional support is how we change our interactions and the learning supports that we put in place to scaffold that development. So the first 2 components, social communication and emotional regulation, are things that we're looking to facilitate development within the child. And the transactional support piece of the model is, how are we going to do that? What's our responsibilities as partners? If we want to see change in the child, in the students, in the individuals that we care about, we have to be willing to change too. So SCERTS really is a learning partnership model. Change in the child, change in the partners creates this kind of needed change overall that we're after. So I do want to ask another question, just so I have a little bit of a background, and Jackie's got another question she's going to pop up for us, just around the general age of the individuals in your life that you care about, your children, your grandchildren, the people that you're here representing, just so I have a sense of who we have. All right, so it looks like mostly school age, but we've got a good smattering across all the age ranges that I popped up there. So everybody's represented in some ways. We don't have much time today to get into real specifics for different age ranges. We were going to talk about developmental levels, but again, if you have questions at the end, please share them. But that's nice for me to have a sense of who's here and who the kiddos in your lives are. Okay, so we now know a little bit about SCERTS, and for some reason my screen doesn't want to go. There we go. Okay, so when we talk about SCERTS and we talk about this idea of social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional support, those three domains are geared at supporting development in what we consider social communicative competence. And that's our goal. Our goal is social communicative competence within this model, because we know that social communicative competence plays a major role in our ability and our success to form relationships and to function throughout our lives, right? So to engage in the activities that we enjoy, to have success in interactions with other people and build relationships and basically navigate our communities in ways that are really fulfilling to us. It really relates to quality of life, right? It's how connected can you be to other people? And so we know when we're working with children with autism and related social communicative disabilities like Phelan-McDermid, we know their social communicative competence is compromised by the nature of the challenges that they face. So this is where we want to intervene, because what we're really after is good quality of life for the children and the individuals that we care about with these diagnoses. And my computer's acting very odd at the moment, so I'm sorry if you're hearing that like clunkiness in the background. I'm not sure why it's doing that. So our goal then is to figure out what areas support the development of social communicative competence, right? So if that's a goal and we know that we have a population of individuals that we care about who are challenged in this area, it's our job as educators, as family members, as partners to figure out what do we have to support to develop growth in those areas. And there's been several meta-analyses that have been done to date looking at educational methodology that talk about our primary objectives, if our goal is social communicative competence, is working towards gains in spontaneous communication. So having an individual at whatever developmental level they are at be able to initiate communication with other people for a variety of reasons, again, using whatever means that they have available to them in a lot of different settings. That's what we're after, right? So we're after true initiation for a variety of reasons with a variety of people in a variety of settings. If we've got that, we're well on our way to social communicative competence, because they're connecting to other people and they're expressing their own wants, needs, and hopefully interests as well. The second part that the meta-analysis tell us when we think about social communicative competence is that we want to move towards generalization of gains within functional activities. So what does that mean? That means it's not just simply teaching a student or a child to do something in one setting with one person. It's helping them be able to use that skill that they're learning in a variety of different environments. Again, different people, different activities. But that's the growth and development that we're after, right? That's where we know that the individual or the child truly has the skill, and it's not just something that they're trained to do, that they can do when the conditions are just right, but that we're really working towards this developmental growth for the individual. So spontaneous communication and looking at gains across functional activities. And the other piece that the meta-analyses are very clear on is that our programs have to not only support the children with the special needs, but they also have to support the partners, right? So as you're looking at this, hopefully you can see, Amy said social communication, emotional regulation, transactional support. Oh, look, that social communication, that really layers really nicely on that first bullet right there. The second bullet, gains across functional activities, you have to be well regulated to be able to use your skills in different settings. And the transactional support piece, the part that we're part of the solution as well as part of the problem that we're willing to change as well, layers on this idea that we need to support partners as well as children on the spectrum or with related needs. So And this is by design. These meta-analyses, these initial meta-analyses were coming out and being written at the time we were writing SCERTS. So we were writing SCERTS very closely to align with the recommendations in the educational field. So it seems convenient that it layers on top, but it's not convenient. It's actually all by design. Okay, so again, if we want to understand how social communicative competence and these three domains go together, I just want to give you a little bit of a layman's terminology in terms of the background of them. So we think about the dimensions, and of course, social communication makes a lot of sense, right? So we know that in general, individuals who are able to display a greater capacity to both initiate and follow conversational focus are more competent as social communicators. And we know that children and individuals with Phelan-McDermid syndrome are challenged in initiating and following in communication. So we're going to think about bolstering both of those abilities for the children and the students in your lives. And when we think about this, you know, we talk about initiating and following. I mean, if you just think about it in daily life, even outside of the context of Phelan-McDermid or disability, you know, you can think about a conversation that feels really good to you. Like you're in that conversation and there's a flow and a back and forth. Right. And then you can also think about those conversations where you're initiating all the time and no one's responding to you. Like any of you who have teenage boys in your homes, right? And you're trying to find out how their day went and you're asking questions of them and they're not coming back and giving you any information at all, right? That's not a really solid communicative exchange. And then the flip side, right, is the person who initiates all the time and you can't get a word in edgewise, right? And we've all had those phone conversations with friends where we feel like we could put the phone down and walk away and they would not know we were gone, right? That also doesn't feel like a good conversation. It really is this back and forth in the flow that we're after. Now, within the context of Phelan-McDermid syndrome, we really want to think about what does that back and forth look like? And we need to think about it in the context of the developmental level of the children and the individuals in our lives. But it's still that connectedness to another person and that ability to maintain connection that allows us to have this social communicative competence, or this base for social communicative competence. So I mentioned the second part of the model, which we tell you is really critical for social communicative competence, is emotional regulation. And this is where we're going to spend more of our time talking when we meet up the next time. But emotional regulation, a lot of times people go, how is that related to social communicative competence? Obviously, initiating and following, sophistication of language, all of those pieces make sense. But how does emotional regulation relate? Emotional regulation is critically related to social communicative competence. And there's vast amounts of research that are very clear and helping us understand that individuals who have a better ability to kind of monitor their own physiological state, their arousal state, and modulate that in a way to be connected to their environment are much more able to maintain their social engagement, problem solve, and communicate effectively. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there going, we know that's a real challenge for our children and for the people in our lives with Phelan-McDermid that we care about. And it is. So we're going to talk about part of it is self-regulation, what they can do for themselves, and then part of it's mutual regulation. How do we support them in this area? But one of the things that I love to do at this point is really point out how emotional regulation can undermine social communicative competence really well. So I would typically ask you, if I could see you and you could see me, how many of you think Tarzan is a great communicator? And Tarzan doesn't typically get a lot of love. Sometimes psychologists give him some love. Sometimes men give him a little bit more love than women. But in general, people think that Tarzan is more challenged in terms of his social communication because he doesn't have what we would consider fluid speech like I'm coming at you with right now, which probably feels like a barrage. I always feel so funny doing these webinars because I'm just talking. Like I'm envisioning you all nodding and responding to me, just so you know. But I love this cartoon. So Gary Larson, Far Side cartoon, he captures beautifully the impact of regulation on communication. So Tarzan's getting ready to go on a blind date with Jane, and he's swinging and he's getting closer to her, and he's really got some beautiful language here, right? So he's like, okay, how do you do? My name is Tarzan. I believe you're known as Jane. And he's getting even closer. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, and you. Like, we've got perspective taking. We've got language at about 4.5 years developmental level. He's getting closer to her. As he's getting closer to her, we know getting closer to a blind date, arousal level starts to go up. So he's starting to get more anxious. You must be Jane. I'm Tarzan. It's a pleasure to meet you. His developmental language level's gone down to about a 3-year-old now. And it's a pleasure to meet you as echolalia. Like, no one has ever said that as a generative statement in their lives, ever. So we've got borrowed speech, and we've got significant reduction in sophistication, right? He sees her, he stops swinging. Now, as an OT and someone who's really concerned with regulation, that's a problem that he stopped swinging. However, he stops swinging, his arousal level goes up because he sees her. We get this quick spike. We get me, Tarzan, you, Jane. Damn. So we're at an 18-month-old developmental level in a 5 frames of a cartoon, right? So we go from this really sophisticated ability to have perspective taking, conversational, to being able to put 2 words together. And the thing that I like to point out in this cartoon is we have all had Tarzan moments. We have all been in situations where we've practiced saying something like, we're going to go into our boss and we're going to ask for a day off, and this is how we're going to do it. And we think we're so ready, and we get in there and it does not go according to plan. And we leave going, oh, if I'd only said it this way, right? Or if you've ever been pulled over by a police officer and you go from a fairly articulate person to somebody who can't get 2 words together. This happens all the time. For our children who have regulatory challenges because of their neurological differences, like your kiddos with Phelan-McDermid, because of the neurological underlying differences, they're at greater risk for dysregulation. So these moments happen much more frequently. And this is why we can see, you know, our students and our kids that we care so much about, you know, be able to communicate in their most sophisticated way that they have one day, and then, you know, the next day not be able to do it at all. And we sit there and we go, whoa, what just happened? And it's most likely it's a Tarzan moment. It's not that they've lost that skill. It's not that they're not able to do it. And it's not that they're holding out on us in any way. It's that something's probably off in terms of their regulation, their ability to focus their attention and participate in the environment in the way that allows them to be fully actively engaged. So this component of regulation is really important in terms of this idea of social communicative competence that we're talking about within the model, and we hold up. So when we talk about SCERTS, we're going to talk about how do we develop goals in social communication, and how do we develop goals in regulation? And oftentimes, how do those 2 things mesh together? How do I support regulation so they can develop the communication skills? How do I support regulation so they can initiate more frequently? That's kind of the partnership that we really want to be thinking about as we're thinking about this model. Just very quickly, in terms of emotional regulation, it is important to say within the context of our model that all behavior serves a function. So when we look at a child or a student or individual who's having challenging behavior, we are constantly trying to figure out what that is, and not just from the perspective of kind of a traditional FBA, you know, those 5 categories. We think really deeply about how and why somebody's engaging in a behavior and how that relates to communication and what it is in the context of regulation and those types of things. So again, hopefully we'll dive into that a little bit more the next time we have a chance to meet up. I do love this quote. This is a woman with autism, and I just think it so beautifully captures what we need to think about for our individuals in our lives who are more challenged in terms of communication and have regulatory challenges. You know, so oftentimes people are so focused on the behavior and wanting to change the behavior. And Roz just, I think she captures it beautifully. She says if behavior was the only issue, this would be no different than naughty child syndrome. And she goes on to say this, really isn't about the behavior at all. The behavior is just a manifestation of my underlying neurological differences. And I think you can probably all relate to that when you think about your kiddos and some of the challenges that they encounter throughout their day. So the behavior itself may be challenging, but the root of it is really in the neurological differences and the mismatch between what's happening in the environment and how they're processing it and able to feel comfortable and engaged in that environment. So I love listening to individuals who are neurodiverse because they give us such great insight and make us stop and think, which I think is fantastic. Okay, I am going to jump ahead to this slide, which is the transactional support slide. Oop, I'm going to jump that far. The transactional support slide, I said the first two abilities, social communication and emotional regulation, are what we're really looking to foster within the child, and that's what we are after for sure. So what we want to do in terms of social communication and emotional regulation is develop those foundations which relate to social communicative competence, but we can't do it without transactional support because you can't be a competent social communicator without a partner. So this is where the partner comes in. And we know, and I'm sure if I could see you now that you would be going, yes, yes, yes. We know that those of you, you know, your children and the way you communicate and interact with them, you probably have a whole level of ease and understanding with your child in terms of their unique interaction style and their unique communication methods that can be really challenging to somebody who doesn't know the child, right? So you might have this whole kind of ease and understanding and go, I know exactly what they mean when they do that. But the new school teacher at the new school is totally baffled and not responsive to your child when they do that thing, right? And that's why we try to have all those meetings up front and develop care plans and everything, and try to capture as much of an IEP as possible. But there's something about the relationship, the ease, the trust, and you know, you being mom, dad, grandma, brother, sister, that there's that relationship that allows kind of this known entity for communication, which can be so hard for somebody new. The goal within SCERTS is to share that magic that you have, right? So how did you develop that understanding? How do you share that understanding of your child's communication? How do you help this other person become a predictable, trustworthy communicator for your child, right? Because that's what we're after. We're after your child recognizing, understanding, and knowing that this other person that's going to interact with them, this communicative partner, is going to be predictable, is going to be responsive, is going to honor their communication attempts. Because when your children know people are going to do that, that's when they're much more likely to feel better regulated and initiate more frequently, which we said we're after. So this transactional support side becomes really important, and it's really helping partners be understanding so that they really can be responsive and make your children feel like they're effective and efficient communicators, like really solid, that they've got it down. So that is one of the pieces that we're definitely after in terms of transactional supports. Okay, so I think we've clearly established that these are areas of challenges for children with you know, profound intellectual multiple disabilities, and that these areas are definitely impacted for your children and children with related social communicative difficulties. I also love this quote from Roz, again, a neurodiverse woman, who just says you have to have high expectations for individuals with ASD, but with appropriate and when necessary, high levels of support. And that's what SCERTS really strives to do, right? We don't put any limits on where we think somebody can go in terms of their learning. We want to have high expectations, but we want to meet them at their developmental level. And when we meet them at their developmental level, we want to put all the supports in place that will help move them forward. So we have a curriculum within the model, which I'll have a few minutes to talk about, I promise, before we break for questions. But we have a curriculum within the model which has a clear scope and sequence of goals and objectives for individuals with social communicative learning differences. So in terms of social communication and emotional regulation, but we also have a full scope and sequence of goals and objectives for the partners. So when we assess a child, we also assess their partners. And when we select goals and objectives for the child, we select goals and objectives for the partners. And it's a team. It's not like everybody gets their own individual goals and objectives. But that's the nature of SCERTS, is we look at the child and their natural partners in natural context and see what skills and abilities they're using, what the next steps are, and then how partners are going to facilitate that. That's the nature of our assessment process, and we'll touch a little bit more on that before we end this evening. But I do want you to know that SCERTS is basically a framework. So it is a model, yes, but it's a framework, and it's a framework that allows us to pull in different evidence-based practices to address goals and objectives in communication and regulation. So on this slide, you can see we've got things like TEACH, and we've got PECS and augmentative communication. As long as there's an evidence base behind it, and it addresses at the appropriate developmental level for the child or student in our lives with the social communicative learning difference, we can pull it in. So what does that mean? That means if I'm working with a child who is what we would consider an early language partner within the model, which means representational speech, and I say speech as in any augmentation. It can be signs, pictures, sign language, anything, not necessarily spoken words, but those first words are coming in, kind of, just very, very emerging. Of course, we're going to pull in augmentative communication for that child, and there's a research behind it to want to do it at that point, right? So we're going to make sure that we pull things in at the right time for the child so that developmentally it makes sense, that we're not shooting too high. It's not like we're going to bring in an iPad with Proloquo to go loaded in 2,000 vocabulary words for that child. We might bring in a Go Talk, or we might bring in a Big Mac switch. We're going to think very carefully about what the right developmental level is for that student. Okay, so this piece is something that I do want to talk about briefly before I talk a little bit about the curriculum, before we break for your questions. And this is really important within the context of the model. SCERTS is a developmental model. And so everything falls out from this slide that you're looking at here. And when I say everything falls out from this slide, I've just said our priorities are developing social communicative competence. We know that we're working with populations of children and individuals who have challenges in communication and regulation, and we need to scaffold their development. In that it's a developmental model, we have to figure out the developmental level of the individual that we're supporting. So this is how we do it in SCERTS. We determine whether they're a social partner, a language partner, or a conversational partner. Okay. Once we make that determination, that launches us into a whole direction about the types of supports and the types of goals or objectives that we might choose for the child in our lives who has these challenges. So our social partners, and this is where I wish I had popped up a poll question for you guys as well. Both of the children that I worked with, well, that's not true. Both of them were social partners at one point, and one was moving into the language partner phase, for sure. But our social partners are developmentally youngest children. So it does not matter what their chronological age is. This is purely done by communication level. So social partners are children who are communicating in pre-symbolic nonverbal means, kids who are using proximity, gestures, facial expressions, reenactment of routines that they've been engaged in, those types of things. Those are our social partners. They are not using any symbolic form of communication. No pictures, no signs, no symbols in any way. So those are developmentally youngest children. Again, it does not matter what their chronological age is. Our language partners are children who do have some symbolic capacity. And when I say symbolic capacity, that means they know something represents something else. Something can stand for something. So they may use a picture symbol. They might use some basic signs, They can maybe use a spoken word or some augmentative system like a Big Mac switch or a Go Talk. Our language partners are children who have representation. We consider them to be emerging language kiddos. And as such, within the model, we would say children who have vocabularies up to about 100 words. And so starting, we say starting at 3 words up to about 100 words would be our language partners. And then our conversational partners are developmentally most sophisticated. And these are children who have vocabularies well over 100 words and can create novel utterances, sentences, ideas, and communicate them, whether it's through augmentative means or through spoken words, either one. On their own, so they'd have at least 20 novel word combinations. So our social partners are non-symbolic communicators, but they're initiating in maybe unique and idiosyncratic ways. Our language partners are the kids who have early symbolic development, and our conversational partners are individuals who are able to put words together to create things. So we have a few minutes before we break for questions. What I want to do is kind of just familiarize you very quickly. I'm going to run through slides. Don't be stressed by what I'm about to do because I always have way too many slides. I just want you to see very quickly how our curriculum breaks down, and then I want to talk a little bit about our assessment process, because I think our assessment process within SCERTS is so very applicable to the children and individuals in your life with Phelan-McDermid, because it really allows us to see how they're functioning in their environments and honor where their strengths are and identify where their next steps for growth are. So in social communication, we have this curriculum-based assessment, and it's 2 areas that we're looking at. One is joint attention, and joint attention is simply the reason the children in your lives or the individuals in your lives are communicating. So is it for what we would consider behavior regulation, so protesting and requesting? And you might say, yeah, I see a lot of that. But then we also want to know about social functions. Do we see any greeting or showing off, calling, drawing somebody's attention? And then we want to know about kind of complex social routines. Are there any back and forth games? Like, what are the reasons someone's connecting? So we consider joint attention why individuals are communicating. And then the other side that we assess within SCERTS is symbol use, which is how they're communicating. So that gets to that language level that we were just talking about. Are they pre-symbolic? So they're using all nonverbal. Are they using some early symbols to communicate? Again, could be spoken or augmentative in some way. Or are they much more complex? So that's the symbol use piece. We also talk about play and social conventions and things over there. But our curriculum identifies a scope and sequence of goals that we assess where a child is. So we actually use our curriculum to assess developmentally where a student is, where a child is, and then we select our goals and objectives right off that curriculum for kind of the next step. So I would be assessing a child in their natural routines with their natural partners. I'm going to sit on the side of the room and actually watch them and see what they do. I'm going to see why they communicate and how they communicate. I'm going to see where their strengths are, and then I'm going to figure out what the next steps are based on using the same scope and sequence of goals. So those are the 2 areas in social communication. I'm going to jump over these. Don't get stressed. Don't even look. Okay, don't even look this up, but I do want you to see this. In emotional regulation, we're going to do the same thing. We have a curriculum, which is a scope and sequence of goals that we use for our assessment. We literally sit and watch the child, natural routines, natural partners. What do they do? And we're going to look at their abilities in self-regulation, how they're able to organize themselves, tolerate transitions, delay gratifications, maintain attention, deal with emotional turmoil. Do they get really excited? Can they bring themselves back down? Self-regulation, what they do for themselves, what they have at their own disposal, usually in terms of sensory strategies, sometimes language-based strategies. For our conversational partners in our model, we'd be talking about metacognitive strategies as well. What do they have at their own disposal? I'm going to assess that. How do they maintain engagement on their own? I'm also going to assess mutual regulation. And mutual regulation is, for me, a really fun thing to look at, but it's regulation that occurs within the context of a relationship. So how is that child supported by somebody else? How do they ask for assistance from that other person? And it doesn't have to be verbally, but how do they indicate to somebody else that they're stressed? Do they send them that signal? And are they responsive? to the help that's given them. So in regulation, we look for self-regulation, abilities that the child has on their own to manage and maintain engagement in an activity, but then mutual regulation, how they access and respond to help from other people. That's the other part of the curriculum. Again, so I'm going to sit and look developmentally, where is my child, where's my student, where are their strengths, and then what is their next step. I should say the curriculum, because some of you are probably wondering, we have one for each of those partner stages. So the social partner curriculum is different than the language partner curriculum, which is different than the conversational partner curriculum. The social partner curriculum developmentally starts at about 6 months of age. So it's very applicable to those of you who have younger children or who have very developmentally young children. 6 months of age until about 18 months of age is about that kind of curriculum range for our social partner, if we think about chronological age. For our language partners, we're thinking 18 months of age to about 3 years of age developmentally, and for our conversational partners, it's 3 years up until, we say 12 years of age developmentally, but it actually extends way beyond that. And we see this being used as a lifespan model for individuals. Okay, so I'm going to flip to one more slide, and then I know we have to take questions because I always have way too much going on. But we're going to talk more. It's going to be fantastic. Oh, it's not here. Why isn't? Don't you love when you think you have something right available and it's not there? The last slide that I wanted to show you that isn't here is silly me. I put all these things in here and I didn't put that one in. The last slide would have been looking at the domains in transactional supports. There are 2 domains in transactional supports. So just like we've got social communication, we have joint attention and symbol use, so the how and why of communication. In regulation, we're looking at how they regulate themselves as well as how they regulate in the context of interaction. So that's what we're looking for in the child in those natural observations. In transactional supports, we are actually looking at how partners are supporting our children and our students, and we're looking for interpersonal support, so how they modify interactive style, and learning supports, which is how they modify the activity in the learning environment and bring in things like augmentative communication and whatnot. There is a scope and sequence of goals for the partners in those 2 areas, interpersonal supports and learning supports. So I'm looking at a balance the whole time I'm doing my assessment and my natural observation of how's the child functioning, how's the student functioning, but what supports are in place that are helping support that development or maybe hindering too, because SCERTS is all about being honest and having a really clear conversation about what's working and what's not working. So that was a fast and furious tour. So hopefully you get this idea that we're after social communicative competence. We know the communication, social communication, and emotional regulation are key. We see how they go together, and they're really important to address both of those to facilitate social communicative competence, but it has to be done within the context of an interaction with a partner. All of our assessment is done within natural context, and it's a developmental range, and we can start very developmentally young at around 6 months of age, so we can pick out strengths in our developmentally youngest kids without saying, yes, they fall more than 2 standard deviations below. We can say, oh my gosh, they're initiating it, and they're doing it by using proximity, which means, you know, they're coming up and standing next to somebody. That's huge! And celebrate that, and then figure out what the next step is. But it's this partnership. If we're going to facilitate and scaffold development in the child, we're looking to figure out what we have to be able to do that. Okay, whoa, I'm going to stop talking now because there might be questions, and I know we have to get off soon. So Jackie's going to cut me off. She's going to give me what we need to be talking about.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a little bit of time for questions. I know we have a couple, but if anyone, you know, over the next few minutes or now, you know, you're processing a little, feel free to type those questions into the questions panel on your GoToWebinar control panel. So one question for you, Amy. Can you give us an example of a social communication goal for a child who doesn't seem to even notice that other people are involved in the conversation?
Yeah, so it would depend on their developmental level, and I'm guessing, just, I mean, based on the way that question is worded, we're talking probably about a social partner. And if we would go into the curriculum, the first piece that we would probably looking at would be a joint attention goal, which would be response to bids for interactions from other people. So our goal, that long-term goal that we're after is that spontaneous functional communication, but we've got to work there, right? So the first piece is, how do we get that child to know we're in the room, and how do we get them to respond to our bids for interaction? So that would probably be the joint attention objective that I would go after for that child, but I would probably do it in the context of regulation. So I'd very quickly flip to what is it that's regulating and organizing for this child that would help garner their attention so they do notice I'm in the room. I always say I have to wake up every day and be awesome. I have to be the best thing in the room, right? So we're talking about children with social communication difficulties, that the social processing, that social motivation isn't the same as we see in quote unquote neurotypical children. So I've got to make myself better than any object in that room. And so I've got to figure out, probably from a sensory processing perspective, what is it that's going to capture their attention, right? So is it vestibular? Is this a child, depending on their age? I'm probably talking about somebody who's 22 years old now, who knows? But, is this a child that maybe it's an early intervention child and I can pick them up and spin them around and flip them upside down, and then they look at me and I know they've got me. That's the respond and bids for interaction, but in the context of mutual regulation through a sensory motor routine. Does that make sense? Yeah, it makes sense in my mind. Jackie, does it make sense to you?
Sure. Yeah, great. Okay, next question. My child is flopping on the floor in public places. How can this model help behavior like that?
So what we would do first within the context of the model is really try to figure out where that flopping is coming from. And I know that sounds like a really kind of, trite, contrived answer, but it's really important. So is it communicative? Are they telling us they're overwhelmed? Are they protesting because they don't want to be there? Are they fatigued? I mean, there's so many questions that I would ask and want to try to figure out. And that question about are they fatigued is an actually real one, because a lot of times behavior is very adaptive. It might not be communicative or regulatory. So we've got to think really widely and broadly about it. But if it's something where they're overwhelmed, what is it that we can do in that environment to reduce the stimulation for them? Or what is it that we can give them to help focus on so they're not so overwhelmed and taking in all the information that's coming flooding in at them, right? Or is it something where they're actually seeking more input? Because sometimes flopping is really about getting more input. I throw my body on the ground. That's, again, I don't know what the flopping looks like. I'd actually have to see it. But when some kids go down hard, they're actually seeking input. So how do I add something in? It's always this question of trying to figure out really very critically where the behavior is coming from and making sure that our intervention matches that. The other piece that I will say within SCERTS is it's not an easy one-for-one, right? So, because oftentimes you'll say, well, they flop, but sometimes they flop because they're bored. But I think sometimes they also flop because they're overwhelmed. And sometimes I think they flop because it feels good. Well, if you can identify 3 different reasons your child flops, you should have 3 different interventions for that. It shouldn't always be the same thing, right? Because if they're flopping because they're overwhelmed, we need to help decrease the stimulation. If they're flopping because they're bored, we need to give them something to cue into. And if they're flopping because it feels good and they're seeking sensory input, we need to add something in to the situation for them. So it's not SCERTS is not a simple behavior like plan kind of program. It really is, let me be very critical in kind of my analysis and try to figure out what at what time. So my guess is it has something probably to do with regulation. It could be communication, and I would be looking at the balance of those things for my child and trying to figure out which thing at what time, and do I need to add in or take away, or do I need to focus their attention because they really don't know why we're doing what we're doing here. And how can I make it meaningful? SCERTS is always about meaningful and purposeful. And I know that can be challenging for some Phelan-McDermid kids about trying to figure out more complex situations and making sure that meaningful and purposeful thing is brought in. But that's what I love about SCERTS. It gives us all the tools to be able to tease those things apart and think really critically about it.
Great. Next question. Where can we find more information on SCERTS assessment and interventions?
So you can come back to the next webinar with us, right? There are SCERTS, we do have a website, SCERTS.com. It's constantly under construction. I would love to tell you it's like beautiful and easy to navigate. We're working on it. But you can definitely check out SCERTS.com. We have a Facebook page where we post a lot of information on that, even just upcoming resources in terms of talks and whatnot. I do have my own webpage as well, which is my name. So amy-laurent.com. That hyphen between Amy and Laurent is very important. If you want free downloadable resources for children with social communication difficulties, you put the hyphen between Amy and Laurent. If you want a new life partner from a high-end matchmaking service in New York City, take the hyphen out. So again, amy-laurent.com, free downloadable resources for kids on the spectrum and related disabilities, no hyphen, new life partner. So I would say Facebook, I would say my website, I would say the SCERTS website. And for those of you who are interested in kind of more comprehensive information, the manuals are, SCERTS is housed in 2 books basically, which are sold Amazon and Brooks Publishing. Brooks is our publisher. And we do have an online training seminar through MedBridge, which is a Seattle-based company, which anyone can access and at any time from the comfort of their computer. So I would say the websites are your primary pieces, but if you're looking for more professional, like really juicy resources, I would say either the manuals or the MedBridge series would be good resources.
And once we make the recording of this webinar available, we'll make sure to share those links as well so that you can access those. Okay, the next question is, it's actually 2 questions, but I think they're pretty related. So how do we find someone who is certified in evaluating our child's needs? And then kind of in relation to that, how do I get my child evaluated? Is the evaluation done in conjunction with a school system? And if so, how accepting have school systems been in working with this model? Sorry, that was a lot in there, but
that is a lot of questions. I love all of them. Okay, so first of all, SCERTS does not certify practitioners, which often catches people as aghast, right? We really believe in building competency within professionals and respecting professional expertise that people bring to the table. So this isn't a process that people like have to spend vast quantities of money to be able to be certified in. Like literally a professional could pick up the manuals, read them, and implement the model. That's how it's designed. SCERTS is all about access. Like all of our forms are reproducible. It's all about getting it out there. So how do you find somebody who's been trained in SCERTS? That's a little bit trickier. I would love to tell you that we have a database. We don't. Oftentimes people will email us and us as individual collaborators and say, do you know anybody in the area? I will often put out inquiries on our Facebook page and just tell people to kind of post where they're from so people can see where people are from. And one of the biggest successes that we have, and because oftentimes we as SCERTS collaborators actually don't know, like I got an inquiry just the other day from someone in Maryland saying their school system was using SCERTS, and I had no idea. Like none of us had ever trained anyone in that area that we knew of, but people travel far and wide to our trainings and take it back to where they are. So part of it's just asking if people are familiar with the model, and if they're not, seeing if they're willing to get familiar with the model. In terms of the acceptance of school systems, that is an interesting question as well. I will tell you there are parts of the world like the UK where it's on fire. Like every school wants to be trained in SCERTS in the UK, which is fantastic. And then there are parts of our country where people haven't heard of it yet. But there are pockets where it's really on fire as well. So in terms of accepting, schools tend to like SCERTS because it is very functional and it works within the context of the classroom. So that K through 2 study that I mentioned at the beginning that Amy Weatherby did was looking at public schools. It was the first study of its kind published by the Institute of Educational Science in public schools, looking at a specific model and could it be delivered in a public school system as opposed to a specialized school or an outpatient clinic, whatnot. Could we train regular ed and special ed teachers? Many of the students were actually in the regular ed population. Some of them were in more self-contained classrooms, but it really was a general ed setting as well as a special ed setting, kind of across study design. And schools like anything that fits within their context or they can adapt. And because it's a developmental model, it tends to work really easily. I say that, and then I can also say, you know, if a school's really invested in maybe a traditional behavioral methodology, it does give people pause because it's a different way of thinking about educating children with complex social communication needs. But in general, especially public schools, I would say have been very accepting of the model. How do you get the assessment? The goal is, I'm trying to think about all the parts of the questions you asked. How do you get the assessment? The goal is to get all the team members on board and doing the observational assessment. So in an ideal world, you would go to your school and say, are you familiar with this? They would say, yes, we've all been trained. In reality, they'll probably say, some of us know, some of us don't know, we've heard about it, we're not, whatever. You would want to get everybody on board, because what you want is like the speech pathologist observing during the morning meeting time with the teacher, and then you want the teacher observing during lunchtime in the cafeteria, and you want to be able to send in some videotape from home so that the school can also see what happens at home, because we didn't get into that tonight, but SCERTS is a cross-contextual model. We want to be able to see the differences, like when they have that ease of communication with you at home versus the more challenge at school. We want to be able to reflect that in the assessment, that there are situations that really promote communication and connectedness, and there are others that are more challenging, and we want to dissect where those differences are. So we want the whole team on board to do the assessment. So it's not like having an outsider come in to do the assessment. I say that, and then I will also say, myself, Emily Rubin, and a few others do SCERTS assessments where families can send us videotapes of school and home, and we'll sit down and do it, but that's not ideal. I will only do an assessment like that if the team is committed, like the school team is committed to wanting to learn about SCERTS and be part of the process, because it's never helpful to have an expert model where somebody comes in and says, this is how you have to do it, and this is why you have to do it this way, because that's when schools put their guards up. And so it's got to be a partnership piece where we really want to work with the school and say, I'm really happy to help you learn this process and learn it in the, with this student to be able to foster their growth and development. Did I hit all those elements of that question?
I think you did, and just in the nick of time, because we are a couple minutes over the hour. Thank you so much, Amy, for joining us this evening. I think this was a lot of great information. It's going to be a lot for everyone to digest. We are making the webinar recording available. It usually takes us a couple of days to get that. And then please join us on May 19th, where we will have Amy back to talk about, I think the next is more in-depth about emotional regulation.
Yes,
Great. So we will make sure that registration link is out, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Sunday.